All right. So today I'm going to be talking about some research that we did at Coalfire looking into why organizations are concerned about software supply chain security and the actions that they are looking to take. And so this is not like a technical in the weeds talk, although I've got some links to other materials like that available. But this is looking at for organizations, like what are the forces inside of these organizations that are causing them, both on the buyer side and on the vendor side. What are the forces that are causing these organizations to change their behavior? A little background about myself. I was one of the founders of Denim Group. We sold that to Coalfire. I'm now a Coalfire CISO advisor, where I work with their client organizations on cloud and application security challenges. I'm a formerly ran OWASP San Antonio. That chapter is being rebooted now. For anybody here from San Antonio? No, everybody? All right, good. So in November, in a couple weeks in November, they're going to be rebooting that chapter. And I was formerly on the membership committee. And I'm a developer by background, with a lot of Java stuff in the mid to late 90s, server-side Java stuff, and then early .NET stuff. But really what I've spent the last 15 or 20 years of my career doing is working with organizations to help them deal with the security impact of the software that they're developing and deploying. And so I'm a developer that has come into the world of security, as opposed to someone who maybe came up through the ranks from like a systems administration background and into pen testing or something like that. So that's neither good nor bad, but colors how I look at these issues, as I'm coming into this from a software development background. So from an agenda standpoint, I'm going to talk a little bit about software supply chain security and why this is something that organizations are concerned about. This is something where there's been, certainly there's been a lot of talk about this, back through 2013 and earlier. But it's really come into greater focus recently. It started to get a lot more attention, and as we'll see from I think groups that are going to be influential and really important in addressing these concerns. So I'll provide a little bit of background. And then I'll talk a little bit about the survey methodology that we use. The kind of core data for this presentation today came from a survey that we did of 150 executives at software buying organizations, as well as 150 executives at software vendors or software developing organizations. And so we'll talk a little bit about that methodology. And then go through the key findings that came out of that. So some really interesting things, really interesting to me, hopefully interesting to you since you all are here this morning. We're going to be looking at who is driving these initiatives, both on the buy side and on the sell side, and how are these impacting the purchasing process, and furthermore, how is this going to impact budgets and the security activities that these organizations undertake in order to address software supply chain concerns. Then I'll provide some analysis, which is, I'll caveat, it's strongly held, or strong opinions that are weakly held. Again, like this is, I think, interesting data. It's valuable data. Came from a survey, and we tried to make that survey reflective, not of some kind of like schemy marketing goal, but of actually reflective of what organizations are doing. Because we're using that, at Coalfire, we're using that data to make decisions about where we allocate resources as well. So I'll provide some analysis as well as some thoughts on what I think the next steps will be in the industry, and then have some time for questions. So to set the backdrop for this, and I'll talk a little bit about digital transformation, which is like a grossly overused marketing term, but I think it does capture something that is really important to understand about the way organizations are viewing the world, and from the security standpoint are viewing risk, right? And so digital transformation, the way I see this is the market pressures that are coming to organizations and saying you need to iterate and innovate faster, right? You need to be able to move faster because other people in the industry, they're moving fast as well, right? And we're seeing a greater integration, both internally to see, are your internal systems, are they integrated such that they work together in an effective way, as well as being able to integrate the systems that you're building with other external stakeholders, with trading partners, customers, and other organizations like that. And what we're seeing is organizations are being forced to serve new stakeholders, right? And so that is the strategic backdrop. Like that's what's happening in the world and across the industry, not the security industry. I'm talking the real world where people, make things and sell things and drive cars and fly planes and things like that. And we talk a lot about risk in security, which is good. Like that's appropriate to be talking, and trying to look at things from a risk perspective. So are we allocating our limited security resources in the correct area? But when you take a step above that at the CEO level, at the CFO level, but at the strategic level, like they're really looking at actual risk. right? If breaches are bad, nobody likes having breaches, because you've got to pay a ransom, you deal with a brand hit, you've got to replace people's credit cards like that. That all sucks, right? And the danger of that happening is obviously risk to the organization. But like a real risk to the organization is what happened to Kodak, right? Where they developed digital photography, right? And they had research and an understanding of here's how digital photography is going to progress. And they got so target fixated on selling chemicals to people to process normal film that digital photography just went right by them, right? So I would rather have 100 data breaches than to be the CEO of Kodak that was like, yeah, this digital stuff, yeah, whatever. We own a bunch of patents and we understand how the industry is going to evolve. Let's focus all our efforts on making chemicals to develop software. And Kodak is a cautionary tale for CEOs. So if you want to think about risk, again, breaches are bad. Being made irrelevant by your industry and crushed by your competitors is really bad. Right, because that's where these are existential risks that the CEOs are concerned about in their for their organizations. Right. What's coming along with this is this trend where products and services are increasingly either solely digital or rely on digital aspects in order to have their delivery. Mark Andreessen's great blog post from however long ago that is now, 8-9 years, something like that, where he talks about software is eating the world. More recently, Satya Nadella from Microsoft, saying every company is a software company, right? Like you can't do the things that we need to do in the world to serve customers. You can't do those without software and without digital assets, right? And so what we see is that organizations increasingly rely on these things, right? And the mandate is we need to go faster. And so what you see coming out of that are cultural movements like DevOps and DevSecOps. Let's break down these barriers between these groups so they can move faster, right? Let's adopt cloud technologies because that's going to allow us to scale or to do things in different ways that we couldn't do if we were racking and stacking servers. And just overall, what we're seeing is that software is critical to the ongoing success of every organization, right? And so in a world where software is critical to the success of organizations, risk to software means that you're exposing the risk to businesses, right? And so this is kind of like our time to shine as security professionals or as cybersecurity professionals. This is our time to shine. And it's really an opportunity, and this is kind of an aside, but it's really an opportunity to be a risk advisor to the business, to say, we know you're going to be moving fast. We know you're going to be doing things in ways that are different and maybe make the traditional security teams uncomfortable, but this is really an opportunity for security teams to rebrand themselves as risk advisors to the business, right? That's the way that kind of the carrot and the stick. You can either you can either use this to stay relevant and to firmly entrench yourself in the decision-making process, or you can get marginalized, right? And so this is something. I think this is good. This is really starting to resonate, I think, with a lot of organizations, right? Is understanding that the risk to the digital aspects of what they're trying to doing represent very real business risk, and as luck would have it, they already have a department whose job it is to help with that. So just as organizations have traditionally had supply chains for physical goods, right? If you're a manufacturer, we need to get raw materials, we process those, we make some things, and we hand them off to distributors. The distributors then sell them on down the line and whatnot. And so just as organizations have had supply chains for their physical goods, organizations that are both developing software and deploying software also have software supply chains, right? Because your software is coming from somewhere. If you're a software buyer, you're buying software from different vendors. And if you're upstream of that, if you're a software vendor, like you are building software and a big chunk of that software is probably open source code that you did not write, right? The applications and services you're providing, you wrote some of that code. Other people that you don't know a lot about probably wrote a lot of that code. And there's certainly lessons learned in both directions, but these are really kind of very different things, right? And so looking at physical supply chains, you see excellence in supply chains, rewards organizations. Like that's Tim Cook at Apple. That was kind of the part of the business that he came out of, was understanding their supply chain and really making sure that that ran efficiently, and Apple has done very well. You see challenges that organizations have with supply chain. That's a portion of the problems that like Peloton is having right now from a market standpoint, is the supply chain issues that they've had, right? And so with the supply, physical supply or physical supply chains, you see you've got your kind of demand curve of we have certain goods, we need to make sure that we have a supply of them. If the supply chain gets messed up and demand stays the same, prices increase and things like that. But with software, we're really looking at this a little bit differently, right? With software, there's not a scarcity of access to open source components, right? Like Maven Central is going to let me download the Apache, Log4J or like a Apache HTTP Commons library. I can download that pretty much as many times as I want, right? And so scarcity isn't really the concern in software supply chains, but the integrity and the quality of the components that you are bringing in, right? And the presence of security flaws or security weaknesses in that software, either inadvertently inserted into that process or intentionally inserted in that process. Like that's really the concerns that we have with software supply chains, right? It's not that we're going to run out of software. It's the quality and the characteristics of the software that we have, right? Like I'm not concerned about the boat from India with all the software sinking, right? And then we'd be like, oh no, we've got to get another boat full of software. Like, can we get a boat of Chinese software and use that for this next run? No, like the concerns are different, right? And that's something to understand, because I've seen some like kind of goofy comparisons and whatnot. I did have the opportunity to do a joint webinar with Garant John, who is his exact title. He's the vice president of the resilience labs at Anteros. Anteros they have software, but it does more broad supply chain resilience. And so we did a joint webinar kind of riffing on like, here's some of the things that organizations are concerned about with software supply chain security, and here's maybe some lessons that are learned from more traditional supply chain resilience. Here's what applies, and here's what is where there aren't analogs. And so that's an external resource that you may want to check out if you want to kind of think or dig into that a little bit more. So what is software supply chain security? So if you're upstream, if you're a software vendor, the biggest concerns of this really center around what components, typically open source components, are you using, right? And for a given build of your software, what are the versions of the components, of the various components that you're using, and are there known vulnerabilities in those components, right? And also looking at what tooling you're using to build your software. And I've got the next slide here is a link to some a talk I gave at RSA looking at that. But looking at what is the tooling, and how do I trust the tooling, and what is the tooling what impact is the tooling going to have on the characteristics of the software that I'm building, and what are the security characteristics, right? If I am downstream, if I'm a buyer of software, and again, organizations can have both of these roles in different parts of the business. But if you're buying software, it's a question of who are your various software vendors, right? Looking at that question of attack surface management. What is our software attack surface, right? If you're building software internally, that's some attack surface. If you're buying software, if you're licensing or subscribing to cloud services, that also represents attack surface that you have. And so as a buyer of software, your question for your vendors are, hey, what are the characteristics of the software that we're buying from you, right? For specific builds, but also depending on how comprehensive you're looking at the problem, also what are the practices that our vendors have in place? What reason do we have to believe that the software they're developing is going to have an acceptable characteristics? We'll talk a little bit later about software bill of materials or software bills of materials. Has everybody heard software bill of materials? Good. Those SBOM vendors have been successful in their endeavors. I like to say that SBOMs are literally the least that we can do as an industry, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. So for a little more in-depth look of the mechanics, especially on the software vendor side, software builder side, I gave a talk at RSA this year looking at a CI/CD pipeline and where in the CI/CD pipeline are there concerns about software supply chain security being introduced. And it's a management level talk about a kind of more of a technical level construct of CI/CD pipelines. But that may be interesting. That may be interesting to folks if you're curious about, kind of what does your overall attack surface look like as you're building software from a supply chain standpoint. And I think what you'll see is, like, just looking into the CI/CD pipelines, it's a fractal attack surface, right? Like, the closer that you look at any part of a pipeline and its attack surface, what you find is it's actually like even more complicated, or even harder to kind of get your mind wrapped around in a real structured way, which is kind of scary. So, why is, as I talked about, I remember the OWASP top 10, I want to say 2013 was the first year where they included as a top application risk the inclusion of components with known vulnerabilities. I remember arguing back and forth with Josh Corman about, like, it's not really that important. I was wrong, right? So this is something that that folks in the industry like Josh Corman and others have been looking at for a number of years, but it's really just something that has come into more widespread attention recently. So why is this? On the one side, there have been some really notable breaches and incidents around this. As an aside, like, isn't it? I love now that every vulnerability has to have a logo. That's part of the process. and actually, one of my colleagues, Ali Miradari, I always mispronounce his last name, and I apologize for that. But he was one of the people that worked on the web cache deception vulnerability, which was one of the the 2019 Portswigger best web hacking techniques. And at Denim Group, we had some kind of holiday traditions, and one of those was a Secret Santa, where you get you get someone, and you have to buy them a gift that is hopefully something that meets their interests and whatnot. And so I went to Fiverr.com or something like that, and I got him a logo. I got him a logo for web cache deception because the people that he worked with had not gone through the trouble, and hopefully he really appreciated that. But when we let's look at a couple of these different supply chain concerns, and I think, and there's obviously many more incidents and vulnerabilities, but this, I think, starts to show a little bit of the flavor of, like, how many different directions these supply chain issues can come from. So Heartbleed was a vulnerability in OpenSSL library, and it leaked sensitive information. This was, like, maybe the first time that organizations were like, oh crap, like, how do I find every app in our organization where we're using OpenSSL, right? But this is, again, a vulnerability. It was unintentionally introduced, as far as we know, in that OpenSSL library that then gets included in freaking everything, right? Fast forward a little bit, we've got the Solar Winds breach, right? That was a malicious breach of the Solar Winds, and their software sits on top of a lot of really valuable data, right? Because they're doing network management and things like that. But that was a breach of the Solar Winds folks in an attempt to attack the users of their software, right? And so that's a little bit different. That's not an accidental bug in a library that got included, right? That was a breach of a vendor with the intention of leveraging that breach to have access to the downstream, the downstream folks that were using that software, right? So, a very different kind of attack pattern. Then we look at Log4Shell and Spring4Shell. Boy, were those fun. Where everybody then had to go back and say, like, oh, hey, where are all of our Java applications, and which of them are using Log4j, which of them are using Spring? And especially in the case of Log4j, the answer was, well, we have more Java applications than you'd probably believe, and everything uses Log4Shell. And the lucky people, or Log4j rather, and the lucky ones were the ones that were using Log4j 1.0 that was so old that it wasn't vulnerable to this. So shout out to everybody who is like that bad, kind of the horseshoe bends back around, where your security practices are so bad that you managed to avoid being vulnerable to this particular incident. Your laziness has paid off. Right? And then we saw the CodeCov breach. So again, they were a supplier of software tooling, looking at code coverage. They were breached, and then that had an impact down the line to people who are using that tool in their build pipelines or as part of their build infrastructure, right? So these are a couple of high-profile. That's not an exhaustive list, but that's a couple of high-profile examples of supply chain concerns. And what is maddening about them is it's not one thing. Right? You can't just say, well, okay, well, if everybody was doing software composition analysis properly, we would have solved this issue, right? Because that's would have addressed some of the concerns, but didn't address other concerns. And I don't have any examples here of situations where weaknesses or vulnerabilities had been intentionally introduced into open source libraries to do crypto mining or something like that, right? And so these breaches have certainly brought this to the industry's attention. There's also the Biden administration executive order of 2021 looking at the cybersecurity and improving the nation's cybersecurity. And a pretty big part of this was looking at supply chain security, right? And saying, hey, we've got this software, we've got software is critical to all these government services, and we're not doing enough to look at this software supply chain security. And that was where some of the initial, not initial, but kind of more public questions about software bill of materials and things like that. And so this has been followed up by publications from NIST and OMB, and is looking at like how is the U.S. federal government going to shift their purchasing requirements and their purchasing behavior, because they essentially have they can act from the bully pulpit to say, well, a whole lot of organizations make a whole lot of money selling to the federal government, and if you've got to change your practices and change the way you communicate about your software for the federal government, that then kind of de facto is potentially spread out to to private sector organization purchasing as well. Because of these forces, this is something that I've been looking into, for a year or two now. Just is interesting to see how this evolves in some of the market dynamics. And so, one of the things we did at Coalfire is we said, like, hey, let's see how are organizations responding to this, not just in security teams, but kind of across the kind of management layers of organizations, both on the supply side and on the buy side. And so what we did is we went out and surveyed a bunch of folks. It's funny, doing research. We did a bunch of I did a couple of interesting research projects at Denham Group where we had comparatively less resources, and it always I would disappear for 2 weeks and dig through pen test reports or time tracking system, all these different data sources that we had, and we were looking at and doing statistics on that, and the output of that would be 6 Excel spreadsheets, 800 lines of really crappy Python code, and for some reason a Microsoft Access database, and we would use that to write reports. And I was talking about this with the folks at Coalfire, and they're like, oh yeah, we've got this research and analyst firm. We can just we just make the survey that we want them to send out. We give them the demographics of the people that we want them to survey. They work with us to make sure, are you actually going to get the response? Are these questions formulated so that you get the types of responses you're looking for? And then 2 weeks later, I get a PowerPoint deck and access to an online thing where I can slice and dice the data. I much prefer, for a variety of reasons, I much prefer the way that we did this research. And so that's the report you can download off the web. We've got a link to that. And what I'm essentially going to talk about here is some of the highlights that at least I saw from that report. So looking at the research methodology. So these are, looking here, we talked to 150 folks in software buyers and 150 folks in software suppliers. And on the software buyer profile, it was spread across different company sizes, which is nice. There was a little bit of a concentration in high tech. I would have loved to have seen more in banking and investment services. And it's spread across the different levels in the organization. Kind of concentrated at the manager or director level, but also looking at the VP. We got responses from VP and C-level folks as well, right? And so, again, kind of a good spread of different perspectives on this. Similar on the vendor side, the company size skewed a little bit smaller. That makes sense. If you're a software vendor as opposed to somebody moving physical goods, hopefully you get some leverage. You don't have to have as many people to do your whatever business stuff you're doing. So the company size skewed a bit smaller, still concentrated in high tech and IT because, again, if you're selling software, you probably view yourself more frequently as being in high tech or IT versus other industries. Good breadth of level. And a good thing here is 3/4 of the respondents were directly involved in the application security efforts, right? So they had the knowledge of what is going on in the organization. They were at a vantage point to know, from a software vendor side, what are we doing and how are things changing. So key findings: who drives software supply chain initiatives? So on the software buyer side, and this is something that I think is really, really interesting. What you see is that in 60% of the organizations, the security team was helping to drive these initiatives. That's great. We would expect that to be the most common group, right? I have some questions for the 40% of organizations where they are not driving, where they're not involved in driving these initiatives. So I do have some questions, but you would expect security to be up there. What's really interesting, though, is the second group down, at participating in 51% of the organizations surveyed, was people at the C level, right? So not VPs, not managers, at the C level. That's really important, because it's at the C level where organization strategies and priorities are determined, right? and where budget gets allocated, right? And those are really critical things. I mean, there's only so much that you can do with ground up efforts, right? It's the C-level folks that have to make things happen. That was one of the findings that I remember from, I think it was the first BSIM report, is one of the critical success factors for software security programs was they had to have like an actual like named leader of the program, right? Grassroots stuff is a great way to start, but if you want a sustained program, if you want to scale a program, if you want it to live over time, it has to have leadership and it has to have approval and budget, right? And so seeing the C-levels that were C-levels being involved at this on the vendor side, that gives me hope that that we'll start to see. They're the folks that have the ability to allocate resources and to make sure this is something that gets sustained and can be scaled. As another side, my colleague John Dixon did a report. Surveyed a bunch of organizations on AppSec champions, and that was one of the key challenges that he found in AppSec champions. Is there was so much turnover in leadership of app security programs. It caused a lot of these AppSec champion programs to get reset and never really to be able to get the traction that they wanted. So if AppSec champions is something that you're interested in, again, that report's up online as well. Okay. So when we flip this around to the vendor, so that's on the buyer side, right? Really interesting thing that came out of that. C-level folks are thinking about this, talking about this, participating in these efforts. On the vendor side, and this was maybe the most surprising, maybe not, but the most common group participating in these software supply chain supply chain security decision making wasn't the security group, right? It was the DevOps group. With 71% of those organizations, it was the DevOps group that was represented. Not the sole group. Obviously, if you total these up, this goes to more than 100%. But in 71% of these organizations, it was the DevOps organization driving this, and I thought that was really interesting because it outstripped the 63% of those organizations where security was in there and participating in these software supply chain security discussions, right? So again, I have questions for 37% of the organizations where security teams aren't involved, and I'm really excited to see that 71% of these organizations where the DevOps team was participating in this, and that's really interesting on the vendor side because they're the folks that actually have to do the work. That's been both one of the most interesting things about being in the application security space for a long time, as well as the most frustrating things is that in AppSec or security in general, I think I saw yesterday, it's really more like project managing resources that you don't control, right? Like that's been a challenge with application security. Is the app security groups, reporting up through the CISO, they understand the risk and attempt to characterize the risk, but at the end of the day, they need development teams to change their behaviors. And so seeing the DevOps groups be so involved or so prominent in their involvement in these software supply chain security efforts, that kind of gives me like a warm, fuzzy feeling, right? Because those are the folks that are going to have to allocate time and resources to addressing these types of concerns, right? And so that's something that was really exciting to come out of this to see, because again, just like on the buyer side, if the C-level say we need to allocate resources, like that's required, but we're also needing to see the participation on the vendor side of the folks that are actually going to have to go in and like change their practices, change how open source components are used and updated. So let's look at how does software supply chain security concerns impact purchases, right? And so in a world of digital transformation, delays are bad, right? We talked earlier, this drive, we need to innovate faster, we need to iterate faster, right? Everybody wants to be the first with the most, right? And time to market is key, right? So a concern that I would have as a software buyer is, are my projects being held up by these software supply chain security concerns, right? Am I unable to procure the software and the software-based services that I need in order to implement the initiatives that we have? Because those delays represent a risk to the organization from an innovation standpoint that they're not going to be able to keep pace. And what we see is some impact. This is not overwhelming, but we do see is 23% of the organizations have a 1 to 3 month delay in procurement that they've seen based on supply chain concerns. And that even goes up even more concern. 9% of the organizations saying we've seen delays of up to 3 to 6 months, 3% saying 6 months or more, right? it's one thing to look at saying like, hey, this is going to be a couple weeks late. That's, I've heard that from people I've worked with. I've had to tell that to a lot of folks. Like a couple weeks is one thing, but we start to look at delays in the months, right? Then we start to see things tick over quarter boundaries, right? And as you start to see things tick over quarter boundaries, then your like strategy starts to get a little more brittle or potentially face an impact. On the flip side of the coin, on the vendor side, purchase delays mean very directly that your organization isn't getting money. Most organizations that I've worked with like to get money, right? Or at least the ones that remain as going concerns like to get money, right? And this is kind of an expansion of a broader thing that I've seen in application security is that when it starts to impact purchasing, all of a sudden organizations start to get really excited about application security, right? So all the good hygiene discussions that we've had over the nearly 20 years that OWASP has been around, right? Like, hey, you should really be, you should be doing this, and it's nice. You don't want to be vulnerable, and everybody says like, all things being equal, I would love to have more secure software, but I've got other concerns. Well, all of a sudden, when purchases start getting held up, like, oh, okay, right? So if you change the incentives, then you start to change the behaviors, and so like seeing money or a delay of money or a withdrawal of money being introduced into the process, that has been the most effective agent for change that I've seen to get organizations start to really care about application level security. I think back there was we had an expansion opportunity for ThreadFix that was being held up, and they'd said, hey, we want to do this expansion, but we've got a new vendor onboarding process, and you've got to go like through the new vendor onboarding process before we can go through with this expansion, right? And they sent the documents to go through that process, and they kind of bounced around the product team for a while, right? Like nobody was really kind of digging their teeth in. Nobody stepped up to handle this, and the sales person on the account was saying like, hey gang, like I'm trying to make my numbers. We got money out here. Let's go get it. And so because I'm an idiot, volunteered. I said, hey, I'll bird dog this. I can probably answer a lot of the questions, run down the stuff that I don't know. I've got a little free time. I'm more than happy to help. I'm a team player. This is the last time I do anything nice for anyone ever. Right, so if you need a favor, like do not contact me, because this was like 2 spreadsheets, 8 tabs, several hundred questions that was very in depth, looking at like, okay, hey, what kind of testing are you doing? Like, what kind of encryption are you using? How do you rotate keys? How do you do threat? Like very, very invasive, in depth stuff, and it took me forever to answer. Right, but again, what we saw is that the sales team starts jumping up and down and complaining to people up and down the chain, and I, being an idiot in this case, but volunteered to help. But what we see is, like, as vendors change their onboarding requirements, that changes behavior, or it forces action. Or sorry, as buyers change their requirements for purchasing, vendors will respond to these in order to keep money flowing through the organization. So the next thing that we looked at is how are software supply chain concerns going to impact budget. And so, interestingly, here, is anybody here a fan of The West Wing, the TV show? Fun show. And I remember there was a quote from Josh Lyman somewhere, one of the earlier seasons, I think. It says, there are only 2 reasons that ever stop government from doing anything: money and politics, right? And and so again, looking at organizations, budget is the corporate love language. Right, like that is how organizations say, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to see more of, this is what I want to see less of, right? And so looking at how budgets are going to change, or how organizations think they're going to be changed budget from this is really interesting. And so like over a third of organizations are planning to dedicate 10% or more of their AppSec budgets to software supply chain security concerns. Right, like that's not non-trivial, depending on the organization, right? And so what are the buyers going to be doing with this additional budget, right? 59% of the organizations said they're going to increase the amount of testing that they're doing on third-party software. 50% of the organization says they're going to be purchasing some systems or tooling to help them manage these concerns, and then it drops off to 34%, retaining experts, hiring staff and things like that, right? So, but what the buyers say they're going to do is we're going to increase the inspection or the testing on the applications that we're purchasing, and we're going to get some infrastructure in place to help manage this process. I'll talk a little bit later about how I think that's going to be really challenging. If you're looking at like every buyer, for all of their vendors, like how quickly does your number of like third-party pen tests like just geometrically spiral out of control? I think there's some things that we can do with transparency, but that's what these organizations say that they're going to be doing. On the vendor side, again, a third of an organization saying 10% of their AppSec budget is going to be dedicated to software supply chain security concerns, right? And when we look at the things that the vendors say they're going to be doing, 65% say they're going to be adding new tooling. That's great news for the expo hall out there. Shout out to the expo hall. 61% say they're going to increase governance. 57% say they're going to be embedding security personnel into DevOps. And so once again, looking at those AppSec champions type programs, feel free to check out John Dixon's report where he looks into how organizations are actually doing that. So what we see on the vendor side, why are they changing their behaviors? And a majority of these vendors, 57% say they're allocating additional resources to the process, and 53% saying they're looking at the SBOM requirements, based on the Biden EO, right? And so what we're seeing is, again, organizations to look at this, what we're seeing is that teams outside of security are taking an interest in software supply chain security, right? And I think that's really good. I would expect security to be leading the charge in these organizations. It's kind of their job, right? So again, I've got some some rather pointed questions for organizations where their security teams are not concerned or not involved in these software supply chain security initiatives, right? But we can't, as security professionals, we can't do that on our own, right? We don't control the budgeting and the priority and the strategy at the highest level of the organization to say we're going to do this or not do this, right? That's for that we need the C-level folks to agree that this is a priority, right? From a hands-on keyboard standpoint, right? We can't, from the security vantage point, we can't go in and mandate, right? Or we can't go in and change the code and make the development teams do this stuff, right? So that's really exciting to me to see teams outside of security that are getting involved in this, right? And again, strong opinions weekly held. More broadly speaking, as we look at this world of digital transformation, where I think security teams need to be rebranding themselves as risk advisors. All right, how can we make sure that as we go faster, right, as we integrate more closely with different types of stakeholders, how do we make sure that we're doing that in a resilient and in a secure manner? How do we do this as securely as possible, right? So now it's good to see other parts of these organizations that are caring about security, because really, I mean, again, to a certain degree, security is everyone's job, and it's the security team's responsibility to make sure that everyone else has the tools to do this. So, that's I think an exciting trend to see. The next thing we're seeing is that software supply chain concerns are causing delays in software procurement. All right. On the buyer side, is this putting your initiatives at risk? Right? Are your competitors going to be able to jam through what they're trying to do faster? Because that's a real risk. I've done work with financial services organizations where they've said, hey, we're willing to ignore the risk of fraud, right? We're willing to ignore the risk of fraud for this particular initiative that we have. We're going to mop that up later. We want to make sure that we have this product to market first, right? It's very important for us to be first, and we're willing to accept risk and some monetary losses from a security and a fraud standpoint in order to get there first, because we perceive that the value to our organization is much greater than the losses we expect to incur, right? And so when we see delays being introduced into the process for software buyers, that's potentially putting these initiatives of theirs at risk. Even more directly impacted are the software vendors, right? If the people buying from you are saying hey, I need you to, first, I need you to report on your processes, right? And more importantly, I need you to have your processes and your practices in line with our expectations before we're willing to go through with a purchase. Whoa, okay. All of a sudden, the app security team is really in the limelight, and it's a question, and of course the question will be phrased like, why aren't you guys already doing this? And the answer is because you wouldn't pay us, because the C-levels wouldn't allocate budget and do all the other stuff that we needed to make this happen and to scale it across the organization, right? So I'm not saying the questions are going to be fair that are going to be placed on the app security teams, right? But these questions are going to come to the app security team saying, right, our purchases are being held up or put at risk because we don't have certain practices in place. You need to get these practices in place so that we can pass whatever the bar that we're seeing for the purchasing organization is going to be. And again, finally, we're going to see application security budgets shifting to put some focus on these supply chain issues. And notice that the way that we phrase the question, we limited in the number of questions that we could have. Really, the way that we asked the question looked at didn't say that there would be new budget allocated to this. That's certainly possible, but is not necessarily reflected in how we ask the question. So I would assume that budget may be shifting to this, right? But at the very least, there will be more budget applied to these software supply chain security concerns, whether that's new budget or reallocated budget. And from that, again, we're going to see third-party testing and purchasing systems to manage this process on the buyer side, and we're going to see new tooling and things on the supplier side. So taking a step back and looking at this, what kind of comes next? I think that this is a theme that we've seen across other drivers, but I think we're going to see this inventory and attack surface management is really having a moment, right? When everybody first had to find all their Java applications with Log4j. And then a couple weeks later, it's like, hey, do we still have that Excel spreadsheet we made with all the Java applications for Log4j? Because now we need to look at all the Java applications to see if they have Spring. All right. Hopefully, we'll move from these ad hoc, kind of knee-jerk, hair on fire responses to these types of things, and again, more focus on what is our, from a vendor management standpoint, from an attack surface management standpoint, do we have a comprehensive is probably aspirational, but do we have at least some idea of where these applications exist in our organization? Software SBOMs, or more pedantically, software bills of material. That acronym's not nearly as fun as SBOMs, but SBOMs I think are going to be something that we see a lot more of. That's something that we've seen from purchasers in the financial services space. For a long time they've been asking, saying, "Hey, send us a list. Send us a list of all the open source components that you've got in the versions." I say, "What format do you want it in?" They say Excel, which means that it's going in a S3 bucket or a SharePoint drive or something, and no one's going to look at it. Hopefully we'll start to see organizations move from, because an SBOM by itself does nothing, right? If you say, here's the open source components I have in the versions, that doesn't do anything until someone compares that to a list of known vulnerabilities and says oh, hey, a couple of these look really bad. We probably need to get those addressed, right? And so hopefully we'll also see, again, move to standards like Cyclone DX, which is an OWASP project, really cool standard for communicating software bill of material information. And then the systems around it. Again, another fantastic OWASP, a flagship project, is OWASP Dependency Track, both Cyclone DX and Dependency Track, led by Steve Springett. And what Dependency Track lets you do is it lets you upload SBOMs for your portfolio of software and then compare that to the NVD downloads and stuff over time to see when new vulnerabilities crop up. So if you're looking, if you're looking to get started, in anticipation of budget, or just in general, those are both great projects to look at. I think we're going to see a drive for further transparency, and it's been frustrating to watch the kind of the work around the EO from the Biden administration, and what is the administration how sharp are the teeth going to be that come out of those recommendations, right? And I'm afraid that we're going to see I'm afraid that we're going to see SBOMs be kind of the high watermark of the requirements that come out of that, which again is literally, I believe, the least we can do. I think that, or I hope that we'll see for further transparency. Transparency into what is the point in time security status of the software, of this particular build of the software, right? I don't think we're going to see a world where you're willing to share your last pen test report. We get requests for that. Hey, can you send your last pen test report for this? And we're like, no. But what we do, or what is a lot less objectionable to send is hey, here's the type of testing that was done. this is the type of stuff that was found from a critical high, medium, and low, or CVSS. This is what has been remediated, and this has been confirmed as successful remediation, right? Like those types of things. We've done things like that, or helped like financial services organizations in the past use a publicly available standard like OWASP ASVS, and to say like, hey, so they can say, hey, we've been tested according to this OWASP ASVS standard. We got the detailed report with the code and the line numbers and the URLs, right? And but here was kind of the character of the report from a severity and count standpoint. Here's the remediation that's been performed. Here's what remains, right? Or here's the schedule. We killed all the criticals and the highs, and the mediums are set to be handled within the next quarter or something like that, right? Like that level of communication, I think, is something that that hopefully organizations be comfortable with, assuming, of course, that they are willing to remediate their criticals and highs in their software, right? But we're also seeing some transparency around development practices. Again, like I would not wish on my worst enemy to have to go through those like crazy spreadsheets, for this organization with hundreds and hundreds of questions. It'd be much better to say, hey, we do ASVS, right? And what are your practices? Oh, well, here's our most recent OWASP SAM assessment, and here's the maturity levels that we achieved and the practices that are associated with that. And so I think that OWASP has a lot of resources that are really valuable for organizations that are looking to find the appropriate amount of transparency to have for software vendors communicating with their buyers. I also think we're going to see this increasingly included in contract language, right? Like right now, there's a little bit of a social contract of hey, if I find a horrible vulnerability, in your software, you need to fix it, or else I'm going to go public. And if I go public, you're going to look dumb or craven or whatever, because you won't fix vulnerabilities in software. We're increasingly seeing contract language that says like, hey, here's and this is hard. This is hard to get like locked it down from a legal standpoint, but that doesn't mean it can't be approached. And we've seen some stuff of like, hey, vulnerabilities classified like this. Here's the service level agreement. These types of vulnerabilities have to be addressed on this time scale. These types of vulnerabilities have to be addressed on another time scale, and so on and so forth. And so I think I think that's a good trend as well, although it can be implemented in a very it can be implemented very poorly. So what comes next out of this? Again, I think we're seeing some executive interest. I think we're seeing both practitioner interest on the DevOps side, and I think we're going to see a drive for better transparency because we need to, as an in a market where everybody has to move very quickly, but where there are serious security concerns about software supply chains, we need to find better ways to communicate and better ways to approach transparency. So here's a list of, these links are all earlier in the slides as well. I just collect them all at the end. And I think we've got a couple minutes for questions. And we've seen that we've seen that in working with organizations about the Log4j, where one organization's like, oh, hey, well, our answer to our customers was we've got an older version that's not vulnerable, and the response back was like, we don't care, we don't want to see we just don't want to see Log4j below that, right? And so a couple of thoughts, like the SCA vendors are starting, or some of them are starting to incorporate like data flow and control flow, so you can see like, hey, you're using component XYZ, but like unless you call the method like cause denial of service, parentheses, like unless you call that method, you're not vulnerable. And so we're starting to see on the tooling side, those get a little bit smarter so they don't kick up, because the standard SCA report is like, yeah, everything's totally screwed. Like, oh, thanks, yeah. As well as, and then we're also starting to see some vendors that will like watch runtimes and say like, hey, yeah, it's you have that library, but that never gets loaded in, right? Or the scanning tools that say you have that library, but you never touch the component that is, or that the method that is vulnerable. But the good news is, like, if you look at Cyclone DX, and I think it's VEE or VEX, VEX or VEE, vulnerability, exploitability, there is an extension or a component of Cyclone DX that lets you characterize in the SBOM, like, hey, yes, this is definitely exploitable. No, this is not in use. This is some questions. And so as the tooling advances, what we're also starting to see is the standards advance as well, or the communication standards advance as well, so that you can make a little more fine-grained or nuanced decisions about these things.
Can you go back one slide for your resources?
Oh, sure. Thank you. I should probably make little bit.ly links like all the other nicer speakers here. Yep.
Where do you see supply chain standards that are kind of emerging, like SALSA, fitting in, and how they can improve this whole picture?
Right. And yeah, so I've looked through SALSA a little bit, and I like it. And what I want to see, like I'd like to see a little more that kind of specificity about the transparency of the communication, right? What I like about Salsa, it's got like the different levels, so it's not like, hey, you're doing this or you're not. I think that's appropriate because then you can look and say, well, we've got, for certain types of software or for a certain amount of time, we can accept things at a lower level, and then we want some more. What I'd like to see is that it fit better in with the tooling that organizations are using, but also more work on like how do we communicate this transparency so that organizations can make the kind of nuanced decisions that this gentleman is talking about. And I think I'll be around if anybody has questions. I don't want to run over the.